This is a submission by Creepypasta Indexer. A Mother's Love. One afternoon, a couple was traveling on by car when at a far distance they saw a woman in the middle of the road, waving frantically. The wife told her husband to keep on driving because it might be too dangerous, but the husband decided to pass by slowly so he wouldn't stay with the doubt on his mind of what might have happened and the chances of anyone being hurt. As they got closer, they noticed a woman with cuts and bruises on her face, as well as on her arms. They then decided to stop and see if they could be of any help. The cut and bruised woman was begging for help, telling them that she had been in a car accident and that her husband and son, a newborn baby, were still inside the car, which was in a deep ditch. She told them that the husband was already dead, but that her baby seemed to still be alive. The husband that was traveling decided to get down and try to rescue the baby, and he asked the hurt woman to stay with his wife inside of their car. When he got down, he noticed two people in the front seats of the car, but he didn't pay any importance to it, and took out the baby quickly and got up to take the baby to its mother. When he got up, he didn't see the mother anywhere, so he asked his wife where she had gone. She told him that the woman followed him back to the crashed car. When the husband went back to look for her, he noticed that clearly the couple in the front seats were dead, one of whom was unmistakably the woman who had flagged them down. This is a submission by Creepypasta Indexer. Gateway of the Mind. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives, so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. This is a submission by Mr. Balbus, Midnight Dancer. Have you ever had one of those feelings that something was wrong? I don't mean during the day either, but at night. I mean that sudden, unprovoked feeling of dread that commands you to wake. Funny. It's almost like nocturnal evil gives something off that your sleeping brain picks up on. I had one of those recently. It forced me up at 3 a.m. Normally when you have that feeling, you lay still feigning sleep. Or if you're feeling adventurous, you take a quick check around the house. After you fail to discover anything, you'd inevitably crawl back to sleep. I should have done that this time. I should have stayed asleep. That night, I sat straight up. For the longest time, I sat there staring into the dark of my house before I even realized that I was awake. Then came the fear. That slow, strangling feeling that constricts your chest and worms its way down your throat. I was alone in my home, wide-eyed, and afraid with no explanation. I couldn't hear the telltale signs of a break-in downstairs, or the phantom sounds of a leaking pipe. I had no reason to be freaked out, but I was. Without much thought, I got up and walked over to the window. I don't know why I did. I peeled back just enough of the curtain to poke my head through, and I stared out into the moonlit backyard. I should have stayed asleep. Outside, prancing around my garden, was a clown. It had ruffles around its sleeves and collar, baggy pants and floppy shoes. Its painted white face was even topped off with a big red rubber nose. It was without a doubt the last thing I wanted to see at 3 a.m. It danced in complete silence, doing a step that only a madman or a child could understand. Its playful manner was haunting. I watched with dread fascination as it circled the garden, trying my best to ignore the growing lump in my throat. It moved around, pausing occasionally to play with my gardening tools or sniff the budding plants. Then it waltzed over to an oak sapling I had planted and disappeared. I blinked. This wasn't possible. It walked behind the thin infant plant, but didn't come out the other side. I should have seen it the entire time, but I didn't. It was like the clown had walked through a door hidden behind the sapling. I should have stayed asleep. I hoped that everything was some sort of waking dream. Pretending nothing happened was easier than the truth. The clown came back, though. Night after night, I watched as it danced around my backyard. And at the end of every night, it would vanish the same way. One night, it disappeared behind a garden hoe, only for it to appear seconds later from behind the lawnmower. Tonight, I found it digging a hole in the middle of the yard. I've never seen it do something like this before, and my immediate thought is that the clown is digging my grave. The hole got deeper and deeper as the clown dug until the top of the hole reached its head. Once finished, it stood at the edge of the hole motionless when out of nowhere it jerked its head around. My heart pounded so hard that I could taste the copper in my mouth. I'm about to tear away from the curtain when I see it bend down and pluck a flower. The clown put the stem between its teeth and planted the shovel firm in the ground before stretching out pretend suspenders and admiring its work like a farmer. My heart was still racing at this point, but I was just glad that it didn't see me. As if the thing read my mind, it turned on its heel and stared right at me. I never thought I'd actually pray for a heart attack. It spit out the flower and ran toward me, its feet flopping to the sides. It stopped a few feet from the house, grinning at me with filthy orange teeth as it pointed to the hole and waved me over excitedly like a child showing off a finger painting. Frozen in place, the only thing I could do was furiously shake my head no. The clown's smile fell and it scratched its head as if confused. Then it walked over to the hole and pointed at it again. I would have told it to fuck off if I could. It stood there for a moment before animatedly acting out its aha moment, and then waltzed over to the planted shovel and disappeared behind it. I stared wide-eyed, hoping it would reappear in the yard like before. I silently prayed for this until the moment I heard my closet creak open. I should have stayed asleep.
This is a true story submitted on Reddit's Let's Not Meet. He made it very clear he wanted me. Submitted by For You Blue. This incident happened to me when I was around 8 or 9, and I kind of forgot about it, perhaps suppressed it, because it really freaked me out. To start, I lived in a very safe, small suburb in California. Literally, the only crime that happens here is someone accidentally forgetting to pay for their coffee at 7-Eleven. Not even kidding. So, that night that this happened, everything was great. I had my 2 best friends over, who I'm still extremely close with. My sister and our 2 friends were walking to have a sleepover, and my mom offered to walk us to 7-Eleven to grab some treats. 7-Eleven was about a 0.3 mile walk from my house, and it was something we did often. So, around 8 p.m., we went walking to 7-Eleven, talking about Neopets and whatever other shit my 8-year-old friends and I talked about while my mom and sister listened to our nonsense. As we approached 7-Eleven, it was pretty empty except for a taxi driver sitting in his taxi. I didn't think anything of this at first. This is until I was walking into 7-Eleven and I felt like I was being watched. Midway through the door, I decided to turn around to confirm my suspicion, and I was being stared at. But it wasn't a normal kind of stare. It was such a deep, intense stare, so focused like nothing could break it. He wasn't smiling either. I remember his hair was wild and curly, and his eyes were a little sunken in. He even looked freaky. He looked at me as if I was a target and nothing could break his eyes away. Peeved out, I scurried into 7-Eleven, trying not to focus on him. So as we're leaving 7-Eleven, I'm praying he's gone. He's not. As soon as I walked out the door, I immediately make eye contact with him, hoping he's not staring at me, but he still is. this time with more focus and a slightly creepy smile on his face. My friends, my mom, and sister are all talking amongst themselves and didn't notice anything. We start walking away, thank God, and I put my head down. Now for the shit. Almost past his taxi, but right near his window. We were walking by him. My eyes meet with his. I'm also a little behind everyone else. Suddenly, while staring at me, he put his fingers in a V formation up to his mouth and licks them. Obviously doing the pussy licking sign. But even creepier, I remember it being really slow, sensually licking both of his fingers up, down, and all over. Again, he's staring right at me. Frozen in fear, he then starts to smile at me while he did it. This lasted for about 5 seconds total while I was walking, but felt like it was 20 minutes. Time just froze. Finally, I broke from his stare and placed myself in the middle of the group formation as we walked away. I kept staring back at the taxi as we walked away from the parking lot, petrified. Was he going to follow me home so he can see where I lived? Almost out of view, a man who was inside 7-Eleven got into his cab and he left in the opposite direction from my house. I told my mom what happened on the walk home, while breaking down crying. No one saw any of this. She told me that I should have told her in that moment so she can get his plate number and such. I also think she wanted to kick his ass because my mom is a bad bitch and did some boxing during this time. I've never seen him again in my small town, and I beg to keep it this way. So creepy taxi man who licks his V-shaped fingers super sensually to an 8-year-old child. Let's not meet.